If you like to corner hard and fast, you may find the Traxxas Maxx tips over rather easily on those sharp turns. The Traxxas solution is to add a little more width to the truck by installing these, the Traxxas WideMAXX Suspension Kit. Soon after releasing the 10th scale Max monster truck, Traxxas introduced the new WideMAXX Suspension Kit, part number 8995. Available in 6 different colours to allow you to customise the truck in your own style, the WideMAXX Kit extends the track out by 20mm per side, allowing drivers to bury the throttle in the turns. The kit consists of extended versions of the Maxx's extreme duty cold weather suspension arms. Plastic in construction, we have the matte black set here. They do seem rather robust in their design, although that's to be expected considering the typical Traxxas high cost, but more so that they are for a bashing truck. Additionally, new springs are included for the rear of the truck to dial in the suspension settings. Finally, a set of wider toe links for the front finish out the new widened stance. And when it comes to installation, it's not too involved either. With the body of the truck removed, we begin by removing all 4 wheels from each corner. At this point, I'm also going to remove the suspension shocks from each corner, considering we'll be changing the spring setup as part of the installation too, each being held in with a single screw into the chassis and a shorter screw into the lower suspension arm. Note that you do not want to mix the front and rear shocks considering they have different spring rates currently installed, so make note of the front and rear pair and keep them separated. Also note how the long screws are up top and shorter on bottom. Okay, so we'll move back to the truck now that we have easy access to the suspension arms. Well, almost. The front and rear bumpers are holding some of the hinge pins in place, so we'll need to begin by removing those first. In order to do that, we need to remove a single screw between the shock tower up front and from the same location on the rear. Now we can flip the truck over and we'll need to remove the 3 skid plate sections from beneath. So begin by removing the center skid plate screws, that's 2 at each end, followed by the 4 in the middle, and we can now remove the center plate by pulling upwards. Moving to the front end of the truck, proceed to remove the 4 screws holding the skid plate to the chassis. And since we've already removed the top screw, we can pull up and slide the bumper assembly forward and away from the main body. This now provides access to the hinge pin bracket screw, although I'm going to leave that in place for the moment while I remove the hubs from the opposite end. Start by removing the single screw attaching the hub to the steering link, along with a single hinge pin screw at the rear of the hub, releasing it from the bottom suspension arm, and another from the front, releasing it from the top suspension arm. With those removed, the hub is now free and we can temporarily move it out of the way. Next, we'll remove the single screw on the other end of the steering link from the bottom, freeing the link from the truck completely, before we now move back round to the front and remove the single bracket screw we left behind earlier, which frees the lower suspension arm completely from the truck, and a single hinge pin screw here, which releases the upper arm from the truck too. Again, bear in mind these hinge pin screws can vary in size, so take care to remember which is which. Anyway, we now have our main pieces removed from the truck, and we'll be replacing both upper and lower suspension arms as well as the steering link. There's no difference between each part in terms of structure or material, other than possibly the colour of the arms you've purchased and of course the length, each part being 20mm longer than the original. So, taking care to ensure we have the same orientation of parts chosen, we can proceed to install. Place the upper arm into position, insert the longer of the 2 hinge pin screws and tighten down into place. Notice how I'm using a hand driver here so we don't strip threads, considering we're going into plastic. Also, don't crank down too hard either. We want to make sure our arms are completely free moving. Now we can get our drive shaft back in place along with the hub, and insert the second upper arm hinge pin screw, again tightening using a hand driver only, taking care not to over tighten. Next, we'll install the lower suspension arm using the original hinge pin, followed by installing the hinge pin screw to secure the other end into the hub from the rear side. Leaving the center to sit in place for the moment, we'll secure that when installing the bracket later. All that's left for this corner is the steering link, so grab your new longer steering link, although before installing, notice how one ball link on one side is longer than the other. The longer end sits back into the turnbuckle and is held in place with the screw previously removed. while the shorter link attaches to the hub, again held in place with the same screw previously removed, remembering to go in from above. And that's pretty much all there is to it, one corner complete. The extra 20mm in length is rather easily noticeable, and we'll double that once the opposite side is installed too, so let's go ahead and finish off the front end. And it's pretty much a repeat of the same, although in any orientation, so we can remove the steering link completely by releasing the screws on either end first, then remove both hinge pin screws from the front and rear of the hub, releasing the hub, as well as the lower suspension arm completely, and leaving one final hinge pin screw holding the upper arm into place. And reverse the process, so the new longer upper suspension arm first, making sure to use the correct piece, before inserting the first hinge pin screw, and hand tightening down without over tightening, followed by seating the hub, and connecting it to the upper arm using the second hinge pin screw from the front. Next, connect the lower arm to the hub using the remaining hinge pin screw going in from the rear of the hub, and place the other end into position on the main chassis. Next, we'll get the steering link attached, again being careful to get the orientation correct, shorter ball end towards the hub, and the larger end towards the steering bell crank. With new parts installed to the front end, all that remains is to secure our center hinge pins into place by replacing the center hinge pin bracket and tightening down into place with its single screw. Finally, we can reinstall the front bumper by pushing it towards the truck and into place, and is secured with the 4 screws into the bottom, and don't forget that single screw up top between the shock tower. Front end complete. Well, almost. We still have the shocks to attach, but we'll do that after we've installed the rear arms. So, moving to the rear, we've already removed the top screw earlier, so continue by removing the 4 screws from underneath, releasing the rear bumper, exactly like we did with the front. And the process for replacing the rear arms is exactly the same too, the only difference being we have no steering link to replace here. So we have the 2 hinge pin screws, front and back side of the hub, both of which can be removed in order to release the hub and half its telescopic driveshaft. The single screw holding the rear hinge pin bracket in place, which pops off and releases the lower suspension arm, and finally the hinge pin screw holding the upper arm onto the chassis. Again, check to ensure you're installing the correct part and then place the upper arm into position, securing it with the center hinge pin screw, remembering to hand tighten and don't over tighten. Then slide the telescopic driveshaft into place in order to seat the hub far enough to insert the hinge pin screw, and tighten into place. Moving onto the lower arm, position into place, insert and tighten the hub end hinge pin screw, and remembering to insert the hinge pin you removed from the stock arm, seat the arm into position at the chassis end. That's another corner done, and onto the last. So, both hinge pin screws, releasing the hub, as well as the lower arm, and a final hinge pin screw releasing the upper arm. And reverse the process to install the new set of arms. Finally, we need to seat the hinge pin bracket to secure the lower arms to the chassis, inserting the single screw previously removed, and all that's left now is the rear bumper and bottom skid plate, which pushes into position just as we did with the front, with the 4 screws securing the skid plate into the bottom of the chassis, and 1 screw between the shock tower up top. Flipping the truck back over, reseat the center skid plate to cover the center drive shaft, and secure into position with its 8 screws. That's the main part of the install complete. All we have left before reinstalling our wheels are the shocks. We kept the front and rear sets separate, and we now need to remove our springs around, so we'll begin with the rear. Remove the single screw holding the spring retainer in place, and remove the retainer by compressing the spring a little and pulling away from the shock shaft. With the retainer out of the way, the spring slides straight off. Repeat the same with the opposite shock too. Now Traxxas do recommend replacing the shock fluid in the rear shocks to a 50 weight oil. We've taken a detailed look at replacing shock fluid with the Traxxas X-Maxx, and the process is exactly the same here, so I'll leave a link to the video in case you missed it, but otherwise I've gone ahead and replaced the oil in both shocks to 50 weight. All that's left is to install the 2 new springs that came with the WideMAXX package, after which we insert the spring retainer and the single screw holding it in place, taking care not to over tighten. With both shocks now prepared, we can go ahead and reinstall onto the vehicle using the same screws previously removed, one up top, and the second into the new longer suspension arm. 2 positions are available depending upon how you wish to run your truck and how you want it to sit, although I'm going with the inner hole for now, which raises the truck off the ground a touch more. With the rear shocks in place, we now need to remove the front shock springs and replace with the 2 springs we removed from the rear, before we can go ahead and reinstall the shocks into position, again with a single screw up top and into the inner hole on the suspension arm. Job done. WideMAXX Kit fully installed and ready to run, providing an extra 400mm of width to the truck, which should really help when cornering at higher speeds. The fit and finish are great, no complaints there, and the install was relatively straightforward. My only concern at this point, considering I'll be running the truck on 4S power, are those plastic drive shafts. Since the suspension arms are longer, the shafts have been extended by 20mm too, which makes them a touch weaker. I'll need to change those out for some metal CVDs, and surprise surprise, Traxxas have a set of those available too, so in the next upgrade we'll bolt these on before heading out for a test run.